How does a human being become objectified, dehumanized, and commodified? This presentation will give us an intimate look at the institution of slavery and its origins in the making of America. Please take your time, absorb it, listen, hear, and learn so that we never, ever repeat this saga again. Mina was the very first slave castle built by Europeans. It was the first permanent facility built in Africa by Europeans, and later subsequent factories and fortresses, as they were called, would also be built by Europeans and also with the support of Africans, first under the auspices that these were trading posts, and Africans and Europeans were involved with trade, no different than the Trans-Saharan trade route activities. And as Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, became more intrigued with the wealth of the great Western empires, he yearned to take and discover the source of that wealth. And it was said that Prince Henry, the navigator of Portugal, established schools, navigational schools, for the people of Portugal to take and learn to engage in long-range navigation beyond the borders that could be seen. However, this is a controversial perspective because while many have said that there were schools, we do know that he actually took and employed experienced mariners and also geographers who could attest to the various wealth in West Africa and the perceptions of the East Indies as well. So Mina, the mind, was built in 1482 to 1484. We know that it was initially called São Jorge da Mina, meaning St. George's mine. And over time, though, it takes on this more commonly known name as Mina, again, because of the quest for gold, initially by the Portuguese. They were fortresses and factories that were set up as assets to Europe, and generally speaking, originally as fortresses, they were set up so that other European nations would not take and interfere with the attempted trade activities that were going on by any particular European nation. We also know that Christopher Columbus, as a young man who was in Portugal, his brother had a map-making shop in Lisbon, and so he had visited this the construction of Mina very early on, which is literally about 10 years before he is able to get financing for his voyage to the West. We also know that as a trading post, manufacturing goods and other goods, various types, initially with the intent on finding gold, and then ultimately, unfortunately, these very facilities built in assistance with Africans also began to house and contain them. This particular castle held mostly females, and later down on the coast, the Cape Coast, you would see facilities for the males, but there was still a mix no matter where the castles were. This is called the Door of No Return. There are several slave castles all around the west coast of Africa, as has been mentioned in several of your other presentations, and they all have this door of no return. The Africans who enter this doorway were going on their quest to the New World by forced captivity. And those who went through the threshold of these doors were known never to return on their own. And more recently, in the late 20th century, as we've come to really understand more about this and make efforts to bring some of the bones and the skeletons and the remains of Africans as we memorialize our understanding of the sacrifice that has been made for them. Some have returned, but most never return from this doorway. In 2009, shortly after Barack Obama was elected the first black president in modern history to America, he and his family came to Ghana, to the slave castles here, to take and acknowledge what had happened. He is the second American president to do so. We know that Bill Clinton had been the first, and we also know that for many, many decades there had been efforts to get an acknowledgement from the United States government of its participation in the European slave trade. And for many, many decades, there was a resistance to doing that. After Barack Obama was elected, he was able to successfully get legislative recognition that formally apologized to African Americans and to the world for the United States' role in developing this peculiar institution as it has been known by none other than the world's most heinous example of inhumanity to man. And it's the most inhumane system of enslavement that the world has ever known. So, as was mentioned before, no Africans who went through the door of no return ever came back to the America. We know that there were millions of Africans who passed through these doorways, and we also know that many of those peoples were and are now extinct. That Elmina was first a garrison and a post that was acquired from the Portuguese by the Dutch, then later the British, and then the French. And we also know that it served as a training facility over time for the Ghanaian police in the 1960s, in the latter part of the 20th century. And lastly, those who have gone through the walls and the chambers of these edifices, this heritage of our nation's past and of our global past, said that you can hear the sounds of the suffering in the silence. And I've had former students and other colleagues who have been through the slave dungeons and castles, and they attest to hearing the voices of those who are moaning and crying and who are dying in the hallways and the passageways of these edifices. The spirits of the dead live today. Known as Ber by the Wolof, these European fortresses, also known as factories, were massive institutions, as you could see, with the guns and the cannons that are lined up along the ocean ways, and oftentimes people would only be able to board in during the high tide that would rise up, and a plank would be put by the door of no return so that those that had been inside of the castle walls could be walked on the planks into the boats. As I mentioned before, there were the cannons, as you see here on the right picture, that are aimed at the water so that they can protect against any European invaders who may want to come in and take the cargo. And the picture on the left is a picture of one of the larger courtyards. And we also know that there were many times the Africans who were brought in to the castle areas were exploited in different kinds of ways. Often the separating of peoples in terms of males and females occurred in these courtyards. The identifying of who was going to what place, those who were identified as rebellious. So there was a lot of filtering that happened in these open courtyards as a way of managing and monitoring the hundreds of enslaved peoples that come through here. And it's important to remember that people aren't born slaves. People are made to be slaves. And so it is incorrect to identify people as slaves. People are enslaved because enslavement is a socially, politically imposed state of human beingness. I'll say that again. That to be enslaved is a social and politically imposed state of human beingness. It is not natural for any person to be enslaved. The Catholic Church bears an extreme responsibility for the nature of the institution of slavery that emerges, as it is one of the major sanctioning authorities to the not only the beginnings of enslavement, but its continued perpetuation. In the name of God, people were enslaved to take and bear gifts to the Pope, to the nation of Spain, and in many other instances, the Catholic Church was very intimately involved and would absolve people for their participation in the African slave trade. This particular building in the courtyard was originally a church, a Catholic church that was built in the main courtyard. We know that by the time the Dutch take this facility over, this castle over from the Portuguese, they had literally converted this church to a mess hall and a trading hall. And as what was mentioned even earlier, that police training academy facilities in the late 20th century were then used in this particular building as well. So it has served over time, over half a millennia, very many different functions. This is, again, another internal courtyard, and you will see that there's a balcony that's representative of the right above the female dungeon. And when slavers and slave ships would come into to dock, and the men would go to take and get themselves together and rest, it was very common for slave women, as they are being filtered to be prepared to go into the female dungeon, that many of the young women would be paraded in the courtyard that would be down below where this balcony is. The captain and maybe his officers, if he had some or a few of them, would be allowed to stand in the balcony and look at the women that were being paraded in the courtyard, so that they could decide which women or woman they would have for a bed warmer that evening or for the days while they were there. To the right, you see the entryway right above the first set of stairs. There's an entryway into the dungeon for the females who were being enslaved. One of the very important things to realize about these castles is that while they have these huge buildings on top of the grounds, that underneath the grounds, underneath the castles, are these very massive dungeons. And depending on the location, on average, the size of the various dungeons could be, on average, would hold 500, in some cases as up to as many as 1,000 could be held in one particular dungeon cell. And when you look at these pictures to the left, if you look at the colonnades right here in the middle, and I'm going to circle this in red right here, you'll see that there's a black lining even here in this front picture to the left of the doorway. Almost halfway up, you see that there's this dark lining, and it's pretty consistent all throughout, even back here, all throughout the dungeons. You'll see, and even here to the right, along the wall, not as much, but you can still see it in here, that this black line represents over half a millennium the amount of urine, feces, decomposed bodies, and decomposed materials from clothing, etc., that had packed in over time. And one of the things that we know is that if you were to take some of this dirt, and I'm going to just take and put an X right here, take some of that dirt that has been analyzed, and all of the different parts of the human body and everything over time were part to the packing and the different layers of the flooring, which now is different in some places where they've actually put some flooring, but in here you can see that it's pretty much been taken down to the very bottom. But at one point in time, that the feces and the urine and the decomposed bodies had risen and created these layers of new flooring over time, such that it had gotten that high up. And so when you think about the millions of people that were abducted and taken across the seas in the Middle Passage and were taken to these places, sometimes people were there for weeks, sometimes people were there for months, and there were also times when there were some people that were there for years. This next slide gives you a sense of the slave castle architecture, where you have to the far right the underground holding areas. And again, you see these black lines as to how far up, right, the flooring had ultimately risen from the again, the urine, the feces, and other things that have been packed over time. And then the center picture is an underground holding cell. And you can see from this picture that there literally is no ventilation. There are no windows, right? There are these doorways, and that's the only way that ventilation would get in. And at this particular time, there's no lighting fixtures. There's no electricity of any kind. So imagine the pitch of darkness that would occur on every evening, and what that would do emotionally to those people who are captive, who don't know where they are. They don't speak the language of the people who abducted them. They don't understand why they're there. And then they are taken away from anything that they've ever known. Family members that they have been snatched away from, children away from their parents, wives away from their husbands, and other family members into these various cells. And then lastly, to the far left are these underground tunnels. Again, narrow, without any ventilation, windows, or anything of that nature, that are completely underground. So here's another picture of the actual holding cells themselves. And you can see here to the left that in this case there are doors. Right here, there are doors. But again, you see the lines here of how the flooring ultimately, right, had gotten so high up for the millions of people that have been captured and held captive there. And again here on to the far right, you can see very clearly and distinctly the line right here where the flooring was raised up. Now in this case right here, you can see that they've put paved flooring down here. But you can see that this line is consistent. It goes all the way across here, across over here, etc. Now in this room here, the holding cell to the right, there is, and I'm going to circle it, a small opening right there for some ventilation. And you would have to have, depending on the location of the holding cell, some type of ventilation, because you could suffocate from the smell, the bad air, the echoing of people taking and just been in just utter psychological distress. Here's another picture. Okay, again, so this just gives you an idea of just how dark it can get, right? In the picture to the far right is some very minimal ventilation. There is a very small opening, but look how high up it is. It's only small enough for some air to come in. And the lines that you see here, these lines are cables for lighting that had been put in more recently as people come to visit these historic edifices and learn from them. And many people have just profound spiritual experiences as a result of this. But I want you to imagine being packed into this place with 500 people, men, women, and children, often crying, screaming, begging for relief, not understanding what's happening to them, not understanding where they're going to be going, not understanding that their lives will be forever changed. In the middle and in the far left pictures, you see the doorways or the entryways, right? And then the adjacent cell here in the middle, which is you can see through the doorways the all of the cells that are very closely connected to one another. This is the death cell chambers. And the death cell chambers were identified very clearly by the markings of the skull and crossbones at the very top. We also know that they were reserved for the people who were unruly, captives who were consistent in rebelling, making it difficult for their captors to contain them. And as a punishment, they would be put into these death cells. And it was known that if you went into the death cell, you weren't coming out. The whole point was to starve people to death, keep them from getting food and water. And when you go inside of the cell, you can see the scrapings on the walls. You could hear the screams of the people who were starving and fighting each other and begging for relief. And once people expired, the dead bodies would be tossed into the Atlantic Ocean. Today, there are monuments that recognize the misery that was here at not only Elmina but other slave castles. And these monuments are to remind us, lest we never forget what happens when man is not checked, and the inhumanity that man not only exhibited, but exhibited for over half a millennia of time. And so it's important as we move forward in our discussions of America that the institution of slavery and the people who were enslaved by it in our presentation narrated on the dynamics of domination and the systemic nature of racism, there are two victims. All right. You cannot be enslaved without creating an enslaved master mentality. And both are haunted, if you will. No doubt the person who is enslaved has it far worse than the people who are the slavers. But they are not exempt from psychological trauma as well, and their own fears about being retaliated against as a motivation to continue this behavior is something that wears on their spirit as well. It does not justify it by any stretch of the imagination. However, it is important for us to know that if we don't talk about this very seriously, then the challenges that we're plagued with here in the 21st century, in the calls for social justice, in the calls that remind us that the deaths of George Floyd and so many others, that there is work to be done and that there is healing to be done, because the remnants of this institution has not been dealt with in the way that it really needs to be. And that will require some work, and it will require people having to be willing to take and be very open and honest, not only of the action that happened, but the effects, the cause and the consequence. So slave ships were carrying human cargo in what's called tight packing and loose packing. And we saw a picture in several of the other PowerPoints regarding the makeup of ships. And over time, the ships began to be designed in such a way that there would be adequate room, not just for the acquiring of slaves, but you actually pack them in like you're packing some other types of commodities and products in various types of ways. Always with chains. And we have to remember that slavery in America, like slavery all over the world, started for economic reasons rather than racial ones. Racism is just how you justify it. So again, in 2009, the Obamas, their whole family went to the slave castles to really try to center them in the beginning of their journey in the White House. And this plaque was unveiled to President Barack Obama and the First Lady of the United States. And as I mentioned earlier, they are the second American president's families to take and come to the slave castles and to publicly acknowledge the United States' involvement in this heinous crime on the occasion of their visit at the Cape Coast, which is July 11th, 2009. And the links that you see up here at the top, feel free to take a look at them as Barack Obama shares what this experience meant for him, having a father who was from Kenya and his mother, who was from Kansas. The product of these two worlds in the 20th century. So on the right, you see the symbol of the Sankofa bird. And the Sankofa bird, literally, one of the meanings is to go back and fetch. That we must go back and reclaim our past so that we can move forward. And you see that the bird is facing forward, but the neck is turned backwards with this egg in its mouth right here. And the egg in the mouth represents the origins, right? The beginnings of a people and a person. And so in order for a person to move forward, right, they must know where they have been, where they've come from, and how they were able to get there. And so that's what the egg represents. So this is the egg of origins. And that you must have a clear grip and understanding of who you are, where you've been, and what you're made of, so that you can face whatever challenges and adversities that you may encounter, and embrace the prosperity as a result of knowing what to do when you have those encounters. I think the most powerful message that every person who goes to Mina could ever receive is the message that is in the embedded in this plaque, in the everlasting memory. It says, of the anguish of our ancestors, may those who died rest in peace. May those who return find their roots. May humanity never again perpetrate such injustice against humanity. We, the living, vow to uphold this. It's a promise that we've learned the lessons of the past so that we don't repeat them, and the hurt and the harm that it has cost so many people in so many different kinds of ways. This is a living tribute to justice. And in the 21st century, the wave of change that we're embarking upon is so profound that these messages are essential for us to know how to work through the pain and the anguish and the healing that needs to happen that has been ignored for so long. No longer can we ignore these things as we take and look to the future. We won't be able to go to the future if we don't address these things in the past. And maybe, just maybe, the COVID-19 situation is one way of forcing us to take and do this because we haven't done it on our own in the past.